Hello everyone, so we will be doing our presentation on the Dutch artist Rembrandt van Rijn. So Rembrandt was born on July 15th, 1606 in Leiden. His family was quite well-to-do. His father was a miller and his mother was a baker's daughter. He was around middle class to upper middle class, which was typical with a family who would be able to support an artist like him. As a boy, he attended Latin school and was enrolled at the University of Leiden. Per his request, he was soon apprenticed to a Leiden history painter with whom he spent 3 years. After a brief but important apprenticeship of 6 months with the famous painter Peter Lasman in Amsterdam, Rembrandt opened a studio in Leiden in around 1624 or 1625, which he shared with a friend and colleague Jan Lieven. In 1627, Rembrandt began to accept students, among them Gerrit Douw. At the end of 1631, Rembrandt moved to Amsterdam and began to practice as a professional portraitist for the first time with great success. There in Amsterdam, he married Saskia van Eulenburg. So Rembrandt's artistic career was split up into different periods, each period differing in styles, influences, and of course the famous works that he has. The first of which occurred while he was still living in Leiden from 1625 to 1631. It was during this time that Lasman, his influence was most prominent, and he was the artist that Rembrandt apprenticed with from Amsterdam. It is also likely that at this time Lievens, his friend and colleague who he shared a studio with, had a strong impact on his work as well. During this time, it was popular for apprentices to surpass their masters, and Rembrandt was encouraged to outshine his teachers. Competition amongst artists of the time was seen as healthy encouragement. Rembrandt made several renditions of his peers' work, some techniques which can be still seen in his own works today. The paintings of this time were rather small, but they were very rich in detail, the detail being like in the costumes and the jewelry. Religious and allegorical themes were favored, as were tronies, which were half-length figures that were not intended as specific portraits. And one of his earliest found paintings were renditions of the five senses. So these four you can see here. You see the three musicians, the allegory of hearing, that's the top left one. Then the stone operation, allegory of touch, that's the top right one. And then at the bottom at the left, there's the spectacle seller, which is the allegory of sight. And then the bottom right, unconscious patient, which is the allegory of smell. So these belong to a series of the five senses. Now the fifth sense has not been found yet, or if we don't even know if it has been made at all. In 1626, Rembrandt produced his first etching, which the widespread of which would largely account for his international fame. In 1629, he completed Judas Repentant, returning the pieces of silver, and The Artist in his Studio, works that both evidence his interest in the handling of light and variety of paint application, and constitute the first major progress in his development as a painter. So the revolutionary change that took place in Rembrandt's style between about 1627 to 1629 involved the role of light. He worked on the spotlight effect, which was where lit elements were clustered in one area, and then the lit elements were balanced with the shadows in the foreground and the background. Rembrandt also worked on the etchings, in which his style was unique and almost sketch-like. So as well in the etchings, he stood out amongst his peers. Much of his fame was based on prints that were produced from these etchings. So after the Leiden period of his career, Rembrandt started to work in the thriving city of Amsterdam in 1631, which begins his first Amsterdam period. Here he produced a substantial number of portraits, including the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, which you can see here, and this was commissioned by the Amsterdam Guild of Surgeons. Partly relying on his experience as a history painter, he succeeded in producing much livelier portraits than those created by the specialized portrait painters who had dominated the Amsterdam scene before his arrival. During this time and throughout most of his career, Rembrandt represented so many biblical stories, which always gave rise to speculation as to the nature of his religious beliefs and domination. This interest was inferred to be partly due to his early life in Latin school, which is where he would have learned about all the stories that he depicts now in his paintings. Some examples of his Christianity-based paintings can be seen in either Jesus as a gardener or what is called here, the risen Christ appearing to Mary Magdalene, as well as another painting called Belshazzar's Feast. Additionally, during these years, influence from Peter Paul Rubens was evident, who was a Flemish artist with whom Rembrandt competed with often. So after this period in his life, his second Amsterdam period began, and this lasted from 1635 to 1642. So in 1635, Rembrandt moved out of his friend's house with whom he was living and established himself in Amsterdam with his family and his wife. By this time, his fame had rapidly grown and he was receiving increasingly worldwide attention. During the second half of the 1630s, Rembrandt was inspired by Da Vinci, and specifically his Last Supper and the combination within the painting of symmetry and asymmetry. So then he tried to outdo Leonardo by completing a livelier scene in the painting you see here, which is called The Wedding of Samson. Finally, from 1640 to 1642, Rembrandt was mainly occupied with his painting of members from an Amsterdam civic militia company, the painting better known as the Night's Watch. His intention was to paint a unified picture, but as the painting was cut off on the left side in later years, placing this captain in the center, it gave up the same impression as his earlier spotlight works, which is not really his intention. However, it is still evident that there is an intended not center spotlight on the two figures you can see, so the captain and the little girl that's a little to the left.
In the following decade, the third Amsterdam period of Rembrandt's production changed in several ways. His production of paintings decreased drastically. The few paintings he made did not carry certain properties. They varied in size, style, and subject. More importantly, he produced no painted portraits. This can be interpreted in only two ways. Either he did not get any portrait commissions, or he did not accept any. This era between 1643 and 52 is one of the mysteries in Rembrandt's career. Speculations resulted in the formation of the Rembrandt myth. This myth suggests that Rembrandt became hugely misunderstood in this era, so he suffered from financial difficulty, and as a consequence, he died in poverty. This myth also suggests that his art deepened during this time. Overall, the myth suggests that Rembrandt turned into a misunderstood genius during this era. This myth is aroused from the analysis of the criticism towards Rembrandt's art. The criticism was made by his younger peers in the following century following his death. The reason for this criticism was because due to the dawn of classicism, and classicism's traditions were against Rembrandt's style and paintings. Yet, there is still no proof that Rembrandt was underappreciated while he was alive. So, the myth of him being misunderstood does not make sense. So, the dry period of Rembrandt cannot be explained with this myth. Nowadays, it is said that it was probably just an artistic crisis, so his style and the few painting that he had done could be his way of searching a way out of this crisis. In his paintings from this era, he used different techniques and styles. He changed his specific usage of lighting in his paintings. In the painting, The Holy Family, he used 3 different lighting sources, and he made an overflowing attempt to use the reflections of the light from one surface to the other. In this painting, he also utilized strong colors, like red, to make it more dramatic. During this era, he also created many highly detailed images, such as the woman taken in adultery and the supper at a marriage. After this experimental crisis in his career, he sought out his new style. He began using the late Titian style. This new style was only effective when the paintings were observed from a distance. His deliberate use of impasto that created light-reflecting surfaces was groundbreaking at the time, and now his compositions were frontally constructed. His efforts for this new style started around 1645, and the style was evident in his work from 1650s and onwards. In his late work, he used light as a way to create an aura around the subjects. This gave a magical feeling to his paintings. Yet, the most obvious aspect from his late work is his brushstrokes. His brushstrokes became broader. Some of the individual brushstrokes remained visible, and there was a lot of differentiation in his brushstrokes. Sir Joshua Reynolds referred to Rembrandt's late work as work produced in an accidental manner will have the same free, unrestrained air as the works of nature, whose particular combinations seem to depend upon an accident. Still, this freedom of hand provided in his paintings did not cause unwarranted sketches. So we can say that his brushstrokes became livelier. Even though his brushstrokes became livelier, his subjects became still. Unlike his early work, there was almost no gesture in his paintings. Regardless of the stillness, his paintings carried a dynamic because of the use of brushstrokes, just like his early works. In the last period of Rembrandt's life, Fourth Amsterdam period, Rembrandt was still an important figure. Many artists visited him in his house, even princes visited him. These visits indicate him being highly respected until his death. At the time, classicism was the new movement in Europe and the Netherlands. However, Rembrandt's style did not fit the classicist traditions, and he refused to change his style according to the classicist understanding of art. He stuck with his late style that we mentioned before, and because of this he was not invited to some projects around the city. Nevertheless, the old Rembrandt was still being commissioned for some paintings, mainly portraits. Getting by doing these portraits, he died at the age of 63 in Amsterdam. The cause of his death is still unknown. Overall, Rembrandt became an important step in the history of art by his changing style and talent. He was one of the most talented artists that lived in that century. His talent and work are still being appreciated to this day. His house is now a museum in Amsterdam that everyone interested in arts should visit.